Thank you very much. I have been a student of English literature, and I chose English literature not because I was Irfan Saab's student. Let me just give the perspective of a student of literature, what I have learned from Irfan Habib Saab, from his writings, from his lectures, from his various talks, and of course, whenever I had the chance to interact with him. First of all, I'll just begin with one observation that it's a misconception to think that if you join the Department of English, you'll also learn how to write correct English. That means you have to read, you have to study, and you have to learn from people who write good English. And Irfan Saab is definitely one of them. I must say that I have often benefited from the writings of historians. And some of the historians, really I love reading them. I don't know what is the opinion of my friends, but somebody like Aisha Jalal, I like that flair of writing. Similarly, I like, for example, Sugata Bose's writing. And back home, whenever I listen to Irfan Saab and whenever I read anything by Irfan Saab, I feel that I have so much to learn. So that is one aspect, that learning how to write, learning how to build your arguments, and learning also how to disagree with some very important sources. I remember in 2001 or so, the English department was given this opportunity to organize one refresher course in English. And the first name that came to my mind was, among the people who I should call, was that of Professor Irfan Habib. And one good thing about Irfan Saab is that he is always ready to help you. He very willingly agreed to talk about English studies in India. Now, during the course of that particular talk, and I'm talking about 2001, when it was still early days for literary theory, many of us were struggling with deconstructive theory, and Irfan Saab just gave a passing reference to deconstruction, and in that passing reference, there was one very interesting clue that he provided to understand deconstruction. Over the years, now we know that there is the linguistic, philosophical, and historical dimension of deconstruction, and of course, political dimension of deconstruction. Irfan Saab focus on the word construe. How, for example, semantics can help you understand the meaning of something. Construe means to understand the meaning of something. And deconstruction actually talks about the impossibility of meaning. So that was one linguistic clue which opened a particular kind of door before many beginners, because at that time many did not know anything about theory. That was one example how one passing reference from a master can open many doors. Another very important lesson that I learned from Irfan Saab, again as a student of literature, you see that Edward Said is a very big name in English studies. Farhat Saab just mentioned Edward Said and Irfan Saab's disagreement with Edward Said. Irfan Saab delivered a lecture here. The program was organized by Royal Literary Society, and he talked about Edward Said. Let me just also tell many students who are here that Edward Said is considered a very important name in post-colonial theory. In fact, there will not be post-colonial theory without Edward Said. There has been criticism of Edward Said from many quarters, of course. Ziauddin Sardar wrote a book, Edwards, on Orientalism, and he, in fact, charges Edward Said for appropriating the whole field of Orientalism, as if there was nothing like it before him. Similarly, Ejaz Ahmad also has his issues with Edward Said, and of course in his book In Theory. But when you read Irfan Saab, or when you listen to Irfan Saab about Edward Said, Irfan Saab provides very interesting observations, and they are also backed by some textual references. I'll just talk about just one or two. One very important thing is that the terminology, for example, how the term Orientalism, how it existed, and how Edward Said uses the term Orientalism or the Orientalists, sometimes in a very general sense and sometimes in too narrow a sense. So Irfan Sahib has his disagreement with that. And one very serious disagreement is, in fact, this was eye-opening also for me, when Said writes this sentence, they cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Now, any reader of Edward Said, when he comes across this word, would think that Edward Said is talking about maybe Indians or Arabs. But in this particular case, this was a remark by Karl Marx, and Karl Marx made this remark in reference to French peasants. So there actually the substitution of this particular remark means that it was a kind of sleight of hand. So this was something very interesting which I noticed in Irfan Sahab's talk. And of course, Irfan Sahab also charges Edward Said for another very serious lapse. And what is that? That Said talks about English sources, for example. But he leaves out Germans. He leaves out any other authority other than English and French, because Said considered English colonialism and French colonialism as prime examples of colonialism. But Irfan Sahab mentioned some very important names, Joseph Needham and Goldziher, who had a very important contribution to make, and Said in fact left out these names for no reason. So this is just one aspect of scholarship where I learned from Irfan Sahab how to write English, how to build arguments, and how also to see some very established names in literary theory and criticism with a critical eye. Of course, there are many other aspects of Irfan Sahab also which one can learn from. And the other aspect is, whenever you see Irfan Sahab in the building, and I'm talking about my experience of having seen him as an invigilator. Irfan Sahab was a very tough, very strict invigilator. And whenever Irfan Sahab was on the round, leave alone students, invigilators had to stand. And they had to be very, very alert also. I hope Nadeem Sahab has also learned his lessons from Sahab. Because our examination team never tires of praising Nadeem Sahab as an invigilator. But as and when he comes for invigilation. And I'll also say that whenever I listen to Irfan Sahab, I always learn something new. In any lecture, in any talk that you attend, you will learn something new. Recently, Irfan Sahab talked about rationalism during Akbar's time. And there one very interesting lesson about translation studies was given by Irfan Sahab. That how Abul Fazl's text, when it was translated, it was also sanitized. That means Abul Fazl is much more radical in his views, especially on religion, especially on rationalism. But how those views were sanitized by his various translators. And you know that sometimes translation can also create a havoc. This is one example. I'll also say that, and here one particular aspect of Irfan Sahab, I think it needs to be emphasized. One particular aspect of his personality, he always stood up for fourth grade employees, for attendants, and for all those people actually who were marginalized. And I'll just narrate one interesting incident. Sometimes in such incident there is an element of exaggeration too. One attendant, one Safai Karamchari, received a show cause notice. He was working in a hall, and the provost of the hall was a well-known professor of law. And this gentleman, Safai Karamchari, came to Irfan Sahab, and Irfan Sahab, as actually the story goes, Irfan Sahab prepared the reply. And later actually when that Safai Karamchari went to the provost's office and handed over that reply, the provost saw the reply, he said, 4 pages? अरे इसको डांट डपेट के खत्म करो किसी को. Just one more very interesting point, I'll just miss, but last point. You see, when we talk about Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in Aligarh, sometimes we appear to actually behave as if Sir Syed Ahmad Khan was a prophet. That means Sir Syed Ahmad Khan had no flaws and one cannot disagree with him. Irfan Sahib has also taught us to understand Sir Syed Ahmad Khan in his context, to understand his ideas in context. So that means no hero worship, but rather to interrogate his ideas. He has deep sense of respect for Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, but he can also interrogate his ideas. So I'll just stop here, although there are many more things to say. Thank you.